Welcome to this ExChange Wales webinar. I'm very happy to have you here today for this exciting book launch of Sandboxing in Practice, Qualitative Interviewing with Sand, Objects and Figures, the new book out today from Dawn Mannay and Vicky Timperley. So welcome, and I'm going to hand over to Dawn now.
Okay, so Ananda and Croeso, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along to find out more about sandboxing. So if I can go to the next slide, please. So yes, so a big thank you to ExChange and Cascade and all the team that have put this together. So thanks very much for inviting us to talk about our book. Thank you also to Harriet, who's kindly agreed to chair this event. And thanks also for everyone for taking the time to come. And if you were joining from Wales, I was going to say I'm sorry if you were going to miss the sunshine, but it looks like it's not quite so sunny today. So not missing too much sunshine at the moment. So what we're going to do in this talk is think about the sort of things that influenced us. So why we started using sandboxing, how it interlinks with other methods. Then Vicky's going to talk to you about the first project we did with sandboxing and the coffee club for mature students and how that started. Then I'll talk about different people's research and different adaptations and additions to sandboxing. Talk a little bit about analysis and sharing messages. And then hopefully there'll be lots of time at the end for you to ask any questions or have any reflections or share any experiences with us. Okay, so I can go to the next. Thank you. I thought I'd start off with a picture of sandboxing, and also we did some sandboxing when we were writing the book to think about ideas for the book. But it's nice to start with this picture because if you haven't seen sandboxing before, and then I'm going to talk about sort of why we started doing it and you don't know what it is, it's a bit confusing. So when we do sandboxing, it's a box or boxes if you're sandboxing alongside someone else or you're in a group filled with sand. And then we have around maybe 250 little objects, and people can make a response to any question about their lives or things that they think should change. So it's been used in lots of different contexts. And once a scene's made, it can be stagnant like this, or some people can do it like a play and move things around. We would talk to people about what they put in the box and what it means to them. So when we went to sort of write this book about our experiences of using sandboxing, Vicky thought it'd be a really good idea, rather than sort of just typing something out or getting a piece of paper and writing ideas, if we sandboxed what we wanted this book to do. So we wanted the book to sort of have links so people understood where the ideas came from, which is why the handcuffs are in there. We wanted it to be a celebration of sandboxing, so we've got a bottle of champagne, but we also wanted it to be a very sort of open book that talks about things that go wrong, rather than presenting it as some sort of magical method where everything is always wonderful. We've got different types of trees and different types of eggs to think about all their sort of adaptations and additions, and that there's not sort of one right way of doing things, but you sort of learn through doing and from interacting with other people, and by listening to the people that you work with to see how they want to work and talk to you. So that's sort of what it looks like. And it's a real shame that this isn't an in-person workshop, because when we do it in person, you all get to sort of play with the sand. But I'll say this at the end: if anyone's interested in doing this technique and you ever want to borrow any equipment, do drop us an email, because we often lend our equipment out for different community work and research. Okay, so if we can go on to the next slide, I'll think about some of the origins. So before we started doing sandboxing, we were really interested in creative and participatory methods. And they've been around for a long time, and it's all about doing research with, not on, participants. So that it's led by participants or led by community groups. rather than the researcher sort of directing all the questions, directing all the activities. So I've used lots of different creative methods, and there are all sorts of things you can use: mapping, collages, drawing, plasticine, filmmaking, Lego. So different methods will work with different groups and different individuals. And I've used it in research, but also in community work. So I've used lots of creative methods in work that I used to do with refugee and asylum seeker women, and also young parents who've made collages about what they want to do in the future. So they're sort of future selves. And then from those collages, we've been able to sort of follow up, put them in touch with people, do different activities. And it's really nice sometimes, because Cardiff's quite a small place, when I see people I worked with years ago and they've still got the collages and they tell me the sort of things that they've achieved on their list and ticked off in those early collages. So it's sort of all about working side by side, handing back the camera or the equipment and making those spaces for empathy and understanding of other people's lives. So sandboxing really is sort of just another method in that sort of whole sort of huge toolkit of ways to work creatively and in a participatory approach. So if I can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. You'll have noticed in the sandboxing picture as well, it's very sort of object focused. So there's lots of objects and figures that go into the sand. And I think creative methods don't always have to be very technical and asking people to draw or create things, because objects are sort of containers of meaning in themselves for people. So just having sort of simple objects to hand can open up different sorts of conversations. And the other thing which is nice when you use objects, you haven't got that sort of interview situation where you're asking questions and you're staring at the other person and they're staring at you and they feel like they've got to give an instant response. So using objects is a little bit like in social work or other sort of professions, when you've got somebody in the car with you and you're sort of both looking out of the windscreen and having that conversation, but it's not so intense. And it's the same with these sort of third objects, because you're both focusing on the objects. It can create a sort of more relaxed atmosphere. So Constantino did some lovely work in his project. So he worked with young Black men who'd got into elite universities, and he was interested in their experiences. But before talking about their education, they just did this sort of warm-up activity when they talked about their family, and they chose a cufflink that would represent their parents or their carers, and talk through what it was about that cufflink that resonated with them. Suzanne Spooner worked with care experienced young people about their volunteering and used a set of buttons. And people used the buttons to sort of tell their story, and different buttons represented different things. So you don't need high-tech equipment. In a project we did with new mothers, because they were brand new mothers, we didn't want to say make collages or make drawings or go around and sort of make all these things, because they were busy with their new babies. And they just brought objects of the everyday to talk about their experiences of motherhood. So objects have a lot to offer when we want to understand other people's worlds and experiences. Go to the next slide, please. The other thing I should mention is the sort of long history of sound and storytelling in Indigenous communities. So often when we're looking at sort of research methods or philosophies, we'll start in sort of European, Western sort of ideas, but there's a whole history of sand talk in Aboriginal customs. So drawing images on the ground to convey knowledge using sand. So we're not claiming equivalence with sand talk, but it is important to acknowledge those Indigenous approaches. So we didn't initially consider these in our work, but since then, Caroline Lynette has made this free, open access, anti-colonial research library. So if you are interested in Indigenous methods, that's a really good place to start. Okay, next slide, please. And then lastly, psychoanalysis and therapeutic practice. So this is where we found the world technique, and then we adapted it for sandboxing as a research method. So Margaret Lowenfeld started the world technique in her therapeutic work with children. So Margaret worked with children who'd gone through different types of trauma, and she wanted to find a way that made it easier for them to share their stories and their ideas so that she could best support them. So she used this big metal tray with sand and water, small objects. So things that we commonly see in the world, like houses and trees, but also fantasy animals and transport and sort of fences so that people could close things off and open them off, and street signs. So she'd have this whole collection of things, and also other things like glitter or plasticine that children could also add to the sand. So there are lots of different versions of sand play and therapeutic work that you may have come across. And we particularly liked Margaret's approach because she really centres what the children are thinking. So she doesn't get them to sort of make the tray and then assign a meaning to what the children create, but she's really interested in what their subjective understandings are. So she always asks the children what each object means, why they place it in a particular way, rather than prioritizing her ideas as the therapist. So this was a real inspiration for our work. And then in our project, we had to try and construct this without any funding. So Vicky will tell you a little bit about how we first got started on the next slide.
Hello, thank you all for coming. It's really great to be here. As Dawn was saying, there is this kind of tension with taking psychoanalysis, kind of inspired by Margaret Lowenfeld, outside of the clinical setting. So it's important to stress that this approach is psychoanalytically informed rather than psychoanalytical or therapeutic in and of itself. So it's a methodological tool. It's an adaptation of Margaret Lowenfeld's fantastic work in this area, but we're not using it for therapeutic practice, more as kind of the lubrication of meaningful conversations. But like other creative data gathering techniques, sandboxing can be what Pam Bernard calls a bit of a sharp tool. And so it can engender more emotive and emotional engagements because of its mnemonic qualities and the time and space it affords for reflection and reflexivity. So like Dawn was saying, having an object in a room can often take away the almost confrontational interview technique. And that's particularly important when you're working with, well, anybody other really than those kind of idealized middle-class participants who seem much more capable of narrating their lives. So in the technique, participants are selecting objects, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but to build worlds and kind of represent their experience. And it also works towards enabling them to lead the conversations. So interviews may move beyond the intended topic and take participants and researchers on unintended and unexpected journeys. And that's what Bernard is getting at with the sharp tool analogy. You're aiming to have these very careful conversations, but you always need to be aware of that tension of kind of taking things in unanticipated and emotional ways. So next slide, please. So as Dawn said, we didn't have any funding for the first project, which engaged mature students around their experiences of higher education, mostly first generation students, and asked them to reflect on that experience either while it was ongoing. We also interviewed participants who had finished their higher education journey and were kind enough to come back and to speak to us. And from the beginning, we knew that we really wanted to try and use this method. But with zero funding, it fell to us really to kind of construct that very first rudimentary sand tray. So I got some help in turning an old cupboard drawer into our very first sand tray. that we filled with play sand from B&Q, I think it was, Dawn. But then the next challenge really was finding a wide enough range of objects to provide participants with a choice in constructing their scene. And we also wanted to follow Lowenfeld's model, the one that Dawn outlined earlier, by offering a range of things commonly found in the world. So houses, trees, people, fences, and street signs. And I was lucky enough at that time to have a child at home with a toy box, which kind of saved the day, really. So I raided the toy box, and as the list illustrates, with Lowenfeld's advice in mind, we were able to include fantasy figures, a pirate, Tinkerbell, witches, and wizards. And so all of these things kind of started to vanish from the toy box over the life of this project. And importantly, as Dawn said, we were able to nab some fences and things that we borrowed just to kind of divide up the sand tray and enable participants to tell their stories, perhaps sometimes in a more consequential flowing way rather than a one scene represents all. However, Dawn's children were a bit too old for toys and toy boxes by then. So instead, Dawn focused on gathering items that kind of lent themselves to the more metaphorical meanings, such as a paperclip, which came up in one interview. And in the discussion about what that paperclip meant, it was for the participant a way of symbolising holding things together. So there are a range of objects that facilitated those kinds of conversations too. And the next slide will give you a more interesting view of the kind of scenes that we went on to make. So here are some of those items in action. So Tinkerbell in the corner there, rescued or liberated from a toy box, was then buried in the sand and was used by one mature student to describe this kind of feeling that they were drowning in quicksand, that there was just too much for one person to do. And she said that she had to do it all, but it was too much for one person. So Tinkerbell was kind of flailing around for help there in the sand. The dragon in the middle was used to narrate a story about social class, wherein one of the participants described attending a lecture that outlined outcomes for children of people who had attended university and higher education, and how they had better outcomes than parents whose children did not. And that really solidified the participants' commitment to keeping going with higher education, although they'd felt at times that they didn't want to and had considered dropping out. The dinosaurs on the right-hand side are pretty self-explanatory if you think about a project with mature students in higher education, but it was a really powerful way for this participant to kind of demonstrate and convey the meaning behind feeling like an odd one out in higher education, sitting at the front of the lecture theatre, attending, showing up, really participating, while all of these kind of students who were characterised by sameness sat in the rows behind. And although it's on its side, you kind of get an idea of some of the complexity and the action behind these stories. So rather than just being static representations of people's experiences, they were very dynamic in places like the slaying of the class dragon, and the knocking down of fences and barriers was a really common theme. So yeah, next slide, please. We used the findings from that project to develop a proposal to run a mature students coffee club in Cardiff University that Dawn and I still facilitate to this day, really. We still have regular coffee club meetings, and we were able to draw down a tiny scant bit of money for coffee and biscuits. And it's been really great to see this develop, and for consecutive cohorts of students to support each other in peer-to-peer tips for how to survive higher education as a first generation or mature student. And it's broadened really to include a number of people who just feel a bit left out, like they're not the normative student of the higher education imaginary. Mike Ward, similarly, ran a coffee club at Swansea University following the same kind of model. And Mike wrote a paper about the researcher as vampire, this idea that we kind of helicopter into research settings, hoover up all the data about how terrible things are, and then we vanish and nobody ever hears anything from us again. So Coffee Club represented a way of actually giving something back to the community of people that we'd been researching with at that time. And I mean, this was a quite a long time ago, but it was used to generate this peer support and a supportive environment, and perhaps a free cup of coffee and biscuits for students who, as you saw on that slide, were sometimes feeling underrepresented and left out of things. And it's developed into a really, really nice community. And it more or less runs itself. There are enough people that have been there over the years to kind of peer facilitate, but Dawn and I are still around. And the same stories are still there, but these students perhaps have some kind of outlet for those feelings of difference and a community of sameness within the university that didn't exist before. And we were really very happy about that. I think it's back to you after this, Dawn.
Thanks, Vicky. So thanks for talking through our first project. I should also publicly apologise for Vicky because I got the slides wrong and then Vicky had to jump in and do one that I was supposed to do. So, but yeah, we're back on track now. So I'm going to talk about some adaptations and additions. So since we did that early project with our wooden drawer and our objects that we'd gleaned from our houses, a lot of people have done sandboxing in different ways, and we've done sandboxing in different ways. But I just wanted to highlight some of the work that's being done. So Rhiannon Manniot's done a lovely project about vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience with women who work with women who've suffered different types of violence and abuse. And she was interested in how the workers, the practitioners, deal with their emotions when they're trying to support people who've been through a lot of trauma. So here you can see there's a figure with their face down in the sand, and the sand's buried everything. So they talked in their interview about how they've got all their family and their dogs and all their friends, and it's all really important. But everything seems to then, so it was flat, the sand was flat, and then they pushed the sand over all of the figures to show how the sort of work sweeps that out of the way because you're carrying around all this trauma from your day-to-day work. And from that research, Rhiannon's also done advice for employers about how to best support their staff. Debbie Watson's done some lovely work with care experience young people. And what she did, which we didn't, is used water. So Margaret Lowenfeld used water. We have used water since, but the reason that we didn't use water with our sand is that it takes a long time to dry. So if you've got lots of kits, that's great. But if you need to use them again, the glittery sand, which you can see in the other picture, that takes about 3 days to dry. So if you're going to put water in your sand, you need to know you don't use it again too quickly. But it does, it is nice to have the water in the sand. It sort of brings back memories of building sandcastles, you know, on the beach, and all those sort of childhood thoughts of sort of playing with sand and being more active with it. In this picture in Debbie Watson and Eleanor Staples' study, the young person has talked about when they were in their home of origin and it was sort of a bit chaotic. And then they went to the foster carer's house and they said there was a lot of love there and everything was lovely and you all sat down to have dinners. And they really liked it there, but they still felt like they were in no man's land, which is what they called the island in the middle. So even though everyone was sort of really nice to them and it was really friendly, they sort of felt like they were on their own island. Kat Turney did a project about transitions. So she worked with children transitioning from junior school into high school. So she worked with them at the end of junior school, after their first 2 months, and then after their first 6 months to see what that experience was like. And she used sandboxing, but also a lot of other methods. And you can see there with the sword in the hand and the horse, there can be issues with the figures. So me and Vicky made our own sort of pack initially, and then we purchased packs. But when you purchase packs, they're sort of highly gendered. So you've got lots of soldiers, and then you've got lots of fairies. And the participant undid the sword from one of the male soldiers' hands and put it on their figurine. So, and that's the thing to think about when you think about what's in the packs. So there's also in the standard packs the limited ethnicity, no representations of disability. So we've later supplemented with other figures. But as you can see there, the figures that we get from the supplier a little, so they're that sort of little size. But then the disability figures, or figures to represent other ethnicities rather than white, because most of the figures are white, are often a different size. So even when you get more figures, there's still a sort of difference in the original figures to the size of the others. And Jess Mannion, who I think is here today, has also used these figures in her work with adults with intellectual disabilities. But we'll come back to Jess's work on a different slide. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So as I was saying with Kat's work, you can use sandboxing with a lot of different methods. So it's not sort of isolated. It's not, sandboxing or nothing else. And sometimes it's sandboxing not at all. So if I'm working with a group and we were going to do sandboxing, or it's an option and nobody wants to do it, nobody has to do it. We don't sort of make people sandbox. It can be quite popular, like I was saying earlier, because you don't need those skills that you need in drawing. But other methods are useful because they tell you other things. So in this project with mothers, we asked them to first timeline their lives before they became a mother. So they made these timelines of significant events, and then they annotated them with stickers, and each sticker was related to a particular type of emotion. So sometimes when you do interviews or you're working with people and you keep saying, oh, how did that make you feel? Or how did you feel about that? It can be a bit annoying. But if people can annotate, they can put out the feelings that they're happy to share with you. So they did those timelines. They also did some word bubble activities. They also did some collages. And then when we last worked with the mothers, we did sandboxing, and we did this in a joint way. So we built sandboxes to reflect our experiences of motherhood, and they built sandboxes to represent theirs. And then we shared our stories, talked them through. So what was really useful about having those multiple meetings and multiple methods was that the timelines really resonated with what was in the boxes. So in that box, you can see there's some lions and tigers. And that mother was talked a lot about having to protect her children and fears for when her children went to school, fears about bullying. And when you go back to that mother's timeline, she has those same bullying experiences in her own past. And you can see the ways in which the past impacts on the present in their experience of mothering. So most people engaged with the sandboxing and were happy to take part. Some of the mothers said they preferred that activity because we did it together. So they felt as if it was more collaborative, and also like they knew what they were going to do because we were just doing it side by side. One mother didn't put any figures in their sand, and they just wrote the word complete. And that might seem like a disengagement with the method, but that was really poignant because the mother had some quite traumatic experiences, and she'd had also some miscarriages. So for her, just writing that word complete in the sand sort of summarised her experience. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? So when we've collected all this sort of data, there aren't any data analysis theories that sort of sweep in and then look at all our data. So it's up to us to try and think about what we do with this and what are the key themes and what are the messages for change that we want to get out. So there isn't a specific form of analysis that's particular to sandboxing. You can analyse it in different ways. But when we use this approach, we always start with what the people say about what's in the box. So we use auteur theory. So auteur theory says the most significant thing about what's created is what the creator intended. So we're always interested in the subjective perspectives of the participants. So we always do an interview alongside what's made. The Handbook of Creative Data Analysis, which you can also use your code for on the publisher, has got lots and lots of ideas about how you can analyse data in different ways, doing word clouds and creating an evidence wall, loads and loads of creative ways that you can think about doing data analysis. But I just wanted to highlight Jess Mannion's chapter. So I was talking about Jess's work earlier. So Jess worked with adults with intellectual disabilities as a research team. So Jess did sort of truly collaborative work where Jess worked with this team to design the project, to generate the data through lots of creative activities, but also rather than going away and analysing the data on her own, again drew on creative activities, including sandboxing, to think about what are the key themes in this data, what do we need to tell other people about. So you can use sandboxing not just to create data and to create connections with people, but also to analyse the data you've got. Have the next slide, please. So the other way we've used sandboxing is to inform sort of policy and practice. And as Helen Cara says, you know, if we're sufficiently skilled and persuasive, let's hope that we can influence others. So going back to what Vicky was saying about researchers going in and running off with a loot, never to be seen again, it's really important to try and get our messages out in lots of different ways. So we've got academic articles and we've got conferences and those more conventional sort of outputs, but they're not always going to reach the people that you sort of need to reach. And in this project, this was a project that I was involved with in Cascade with care experienced children and young people. And we did all sorts of things. We did like whole days where we did bag making and sticker making and t-shirt making and wall climbing and sports activities. And the children who came to those days could do the research or just enjoy the day. So we had a series of these days, focus groups with older people and bowling. So it's quite a big project. And what some of the older care experienced young people in Cascade Voices who've been trained in research methods were also peer researchers. But what some young people said was that we see people like you all the time. You come in, you ask your questions, we tell you what we think and nothing changes. So in this project, we made music videos, we made films, we made posters, we made postcards, we made a charter that went to all schools in Wales. We made magazines for foster carers, like a Take the Break magazine. We made magazines for young people that went to all people in foster care in Wales. So we tried lots and lots of things. Some things worked well, some things didn't work so well. We've still got a sort of legacy website that's still active, Family and Community, that's still getting different messages out. But I sort of wanted to talk about the importance of that, but also how the sandboxing figures have featured. So in this project, the children we work with couldn't be seen, so we couldn't use their images. But we used the figures to tell some of the stories. So the figures that they'd used in their sandboxing are in some of the videos, and the figures are used to tell those stories, to communicate those messages in a very different way. Okay, so if I can go on to the next slide, please. I think the other important thing to think about is the impacts on the researcher. So I had a little badge earlier that said ethics are everywhere, and Vicky talks about the ethics of using sandboxing. And I think we always have to think about safeguarding and the care of our participants. And a lot of the work I'll do will be with people like the Fostering Network, people who are still registered social workers. So there's a lot of thought and care for the participant. But often there's not a lot of care and thought for the researcher or the practitioner, as we saw in Rhiannon's work. So emotion always comes through in research, particularly when the methods take you on unexpected and unintended journeys. So when I first started doing research, one of my early projects was about education and employment for women in low-income areas. But a lot of the talk in our interviews brought up other things like domestic abuse and other forms of trauma. So what you set out to discuss isn't always what's discussed. And I think, psychotherapists and social workers can sometimes access clinical supervision, but researchers, doctoral students, and can feel sort of let down. So who do you go to talk to? And also community workers, where there isn't that infrastructure or funding for things like clinical supervision. So I think everyone really in the sort of qualitative research and creative methods community has a sort of responsibility to help others. So if you're just starting off, always try and connect with people in the creative methods community who are friendly and helpful. So when I first started working in this way, people like Helen Lomax were really friendly and supportive, Janet Fink. So you're sort of not on your own. You can talk through ideas. You can think about, how do I do this method? How's it going to go? How do I deal with this? So having your sort of circle of people. And if you haven't got one, reaching out and making that circle bigger so you can get that support. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? We also need to know why we want to use sandboxing. So it's not perfect for every situation or every group of people. We like to use it because it can fight familiarity and give opportunities for reflection and defamiliarization. So in terms of fighting familiarity, often when we research something or we work with different groups, we think that we already are familiar and we know about that area. And that familiarity can sort of cloud us because we sort of go in thinking we already know, rather than being open to new ideas. So when you give people an activity to do, rather than just asking them questions or talking at them, it quietens the researcher voice. So instead of having these pre-packaged questions, you can go in the direction that people want to go in and understand their subjective perspectives. So you always want your methods to match your methodology and your underlying philosophy and what you want to achieve in a project. So it's sort of not being creative for the sake of creativity. So, a random control trial might be just the thing you need, and sandboxing won't work for that. So it's finding the right method for the thing that you're going to do. And also, sometimes there's an idea that if things are creative, they're always more inclusive or they're always less hierarchical. So it's important not to be too idealistic about what you can achieve with sandboxing and think carefully about its use. Okay, I think I've got one more slide, please. So I think what's really important to do is sandboxing before sandboxing. So as I said earlier, if people ever want to borrow equipment and have a go, please do get in touch. So there's a nice project with creative researchers, and they wanted to use creative methods. And then they found that some of the creative researchers didn't want to do creative methods themselves to be interviewed. So if you're not prepared to do it yourself and do it with other people, really you shouldn't be asking other people to do creative things. And it's good to try a range of things. So have a go with Lego or drawing, have a go with a group of people first to find the right methods. So Adriana Harrow talks a lot about that. So she tried lots of different methods, and she tried Lego and she wasn't good at Lego and didn't feel comfortable. So you have to find a method you're comfortable with to be comfortable using it with other people. So it's important to try out and adapt your own work and work with other people, work with different groups, get feedback. I used to get a lot of feedback off my children. Now my grandchildren are being farmed out. They've done a few trial research projects with different people in Cardiff University. The children and grandchildren are highly critical and honest, so it's a really good way to get feedback on what you're doing and if it's rubbish. And then just also thinking about the ethics being everywhere. Oh, I've just got to say this one more thing. I put a picture in to remind me. It's really important to try things out. So I've been using Sandboxing for a while, but it's quite heavy. The equipment's quite heavy to carry around if you've got a lot of sandboxes. So I thought I'd do something with fuzzy felts. So it wasn't research. I was working with a group of young people and we've been doing a lot of work together. And I thought I'd try the fuzzy felts. I thought, love fuzzy felts. I like fuzzy felts when I was little. So off I trot. My fuzzy felts have arrived. I haven't got them out of the packet, but it's all going to be wonderful. So I take the fuzzy felts and they're all sort of between maybe like 13 and 17. So they're all looking at me as if, yeah, we're not really going to want to do fuzzy felts. And then I opened the boxes and I forgot that you have to pop every fuzzy felt out. They don't just come out, which takes ages. So they weren't keen. Then they saw me do this, the popping out, and they were just like, you're just having a laugh. So they were off listening to music, writing on the whiteboards, doing other things. But a few people persevered, and the picture there is a young person made it, and they said, when you're in care, when you're in school, it's like you've got a funny hat on and a bow tie because no one wears that to school. So it's that feeling of difference. And then what we did with that and some drawings and other things that were made, we turned them into an animation that the young people wanted to use to send messages out. But yeah, do try, don't be the fuzzy felts person that doesn't know they're all stuck together. Okay, next slide, please. So, and the next slide is just say Diolch Ki. So thank you ever so much for coming along and listening, and I hope that it was useful for you in some way. So thank you, Diolch.
Thanks so much, Dawn. That was brilliant. And sorry, and Vicky too. Sorry. That was really, really, yeah, very, very sort of interesting to me. I'm sure a lot of people will have found it useful. There's a link in the chat for people who are interested in the book. All of Policy Press have got a discount code for this month. And so you can look at the other books in the series on creative practice as well. So just wondering if anybody's got any sort of questions or comments. I can't see anything in the chat at the moment, but do raise your hand if there's anything you'd like to say. In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions. So I'm just going to see. Yeah, so there's a question in the chat. So somebody just saying what a fantastic and enjoyable presentation that was. So thank you. And whether you've got any advice on informing policy and practice, because that's where she would like to go next.
Okay, is that Jess?
Yes.
Hi, Jess. I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you feel like at any point coming on and saying a little bit more about how you did the project and the analysis, let us know. So in terms of, oh, Jess can't talk, okay. But you have to read her chapter. She hasn't got a mic, but yeah, it's really, really brilliant work. There's 50% off the book with her chapter as well. So yeah, so informing policy and practice, it is tricky. I mean, it's easier when you're in a research institution in terms of funding. So we got funding through the Impact Accelerator grants. So I got quite a lot of funding through that. So I applied a few times and tried different things. But if you can get little pots of funding, that's a good way to and work with other organisations. So we worked a lot with the Fostering Network. So when I said about the magazines, the Fostering Network do a magazine called Thrive for Young People. So there were lots of editions of that magazine before we came along, but we partnered with them and paid so much into that edition so that we could use that as a vehicle to get some of the research findings out. And we did the same with foster carers. But we've also linked in with the Fostering Network in that magazine where we haven't had any cost, but they featured other parts of our research. So sometimes you can link in with something existing and it could be cost-free for them to feature you. The magazines work really well, particularly ones for foster carers, because some foster carers got in touch and said that they wouldn't have read the policy or anything, but when they had the magazine, they took it into school with them and said that they didn't want the children being taken out of live classes. and being embarrassed in front of their friends. So it gave people a bit of power to, you know, say this has been published without through a magazine, rather than having to go to that sort of dense 200-page report we did for Welsh Government. I think do lots of different blogs on different websites. So as I was saying earlier, we've got the ExChange family and community, which I don't know if anyone can put a link in for me. So we do blogs for things that are of interest to families and communities quite widely. So we often do things about research and new research findings. So, and there are lots of other sort of sites. So if there are sort of charities or organisations sort of linking in and doing articles and blogs with them. Online things are quite good because once you've made it once, it's free to keep sort of emailing out to different people. So that's a good way to do it. We did do something when we posted the charter out to all schools in Wales, and we took ages. It took ages. So we made the charter. Me and a group of care experienced young people sat in the university in one of our nice sort of rooms, and we put all these things in. We stuck all the stamps on, and I had to post them myself because I had stamps, so they didn't go through the university system. So I walked down with them, put them all in the post box, and it was all very exciting. And no school got in contact ever. So when the young people said, did anyone like write back to what we sent? No one ever did. So we know that doesn't work. So then we had an email list where we emailed them things. So with hopefully more success. So I think it can be trial and error, but that's difficult when you haven't got the funds. But I think going to charities, other groups that are interested in your topic is a really good way of working with them and having that wider audience. And also, I did a lot of work, a lot of footwork. So I went to lots of different universities and I did free teaching for PGCE trainee teachers, trainee social workers, trainee youth workers. Because I think if you can get the messages out from the group that you're working with at that stage when they're training, it will stay with them. And I did train someone on a social work course who later got a social work job, and I saw them in town and they said, as soon as I got my job and I was working with care experienced children and young people, I went back to your slides. So I think if you can make teaching and people training in that area is a really good impact site. Sorry, that's like a massively long answer.
Thanks so much, Jill. That's great. I think Jess is able to come on now, maybe.
Hi, yeah, it's working now. Yeah, I don't know what you want me to talk about. I just want to say thank you for such a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I can really relate to a lot that you've spoke about. And one thing that stood out to me is when you spoke about the support of the creative research methods community. So when I'd never heard of Sandboxing before, and I'd gone to one of Dawn's, it was one of her in-person workshops in Galway University, and that's where I got to learn about Sandboxing. And she's just been a huge support, her and Vicky. So that's really important, because when you're doing creative methods, sometimes you have to do a lot of justification about them because not everybody sees them as serious. And the whole thing about trying different methods. So I worked with adults with intellectual disabilities who had gone through disability services and always given art to do, and it's not something they wanted to do. So they wanted to try new things. So we tried loads of different creative methods, and they really wanted to try Sandboxing because they had never heard of it before and they liked the sound of it, and it ended up being one of their favorite methods. And so when they go to like presentations and talk about their work, they always pick Sandboxing because they enjoyed it so much. So I don't know if there's anything particular you wanted me to talk about.
Just about how you managed to use it to help with the analysis.
Yeah, so with the analysis, we had different stages. It's quite big, and if you want to read, you can read the book chapter. I've also written a blog that's summarised because there's 6 steps. But with regards to Sandboxing, we met in one session, and the group decided they wanted to reflect on the project, and they had some questions they wanted to reflect on. So they used the Sandboxing to be able to help them to do that. And at the time, it was an action research project, and at the time we had had a very disappointing outcome that we didn't expect, and it happened live in a session, and people were quite frustrated. And I know it's not used for therapeutic reasons, but it did help us to sit down and relax and think through the problem in a manner that would be able to help us rather than getting, you know, too stressed about it. So and that was kind of the therapeutic of the sand, and it was just really enjoyable and something different. So that's how we used it, and it worked really well. It gave people a chance to sit and reflect on what they wanted to look at within the analysis, and then also to share that, because we did it. We all had our own sandbox, and we all shared what we made, and we shared our perspectives of it as well.
Oh, thanks so much, Jess. Thanks.
That's okay. Thank you for having me on.
So a couple of quick questions in the chat. First of all, do you know if there are any trainings on sandboxing techniques?
No, we should do something, really, shouldn't we? I'm happy to do it if anyone's an organisation, big or small. If I've got capacity and I've got enough notice, and you're close to Cardiff, I'm always happy to come in and do something with you. So I have done some like little, just for one or two people. It's, yeah, 'cause sometimes I have done, you know, sort of some training events, but I haven't got one that's coming up. But, you know, do always feel free to get in touch if it's something you're interested in and you want to come in and have a go and have a chat.
Thanks, Dawn. And then one question from Pauline. Do you find that this method works better with different age groups, or like adults, children, different genders? I mean, you touched on that briefly, and I think I've had a similar experience of trying to, when I wasn't using creative methods, but I had activities for participants to do alongside interviewing, and I walked in and there was a very, very negative response from one of the young men. And I just wondered if yeah, that you can say anything about that. I mean, obviously you said, you know, it's sort of voluntary, you don't make anybody do it. But is there any point at which you would think that would tip somebody over into not engaging with your questions as much as they might have otherwise? Is anybody that dismissive?
Do you want to do it, Vic, or do you want me to go, or me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it works with, it can work with any age group or any person. So it's just an individual might not want to do sandboxing, but I haven't, because when I carrying all my stuff around, people will be like, oh, you're going to work with children. So we started sandboxing with mature students who are adults. We've worked with mothers who are adults. So adults and children generally, it's a thing they will engage with more than drawing. Drawing is the one where people are like, no, like particularly adults, because I think a lot of children, when it's a drawing thing, they'll do their thing and they're like, look at that, it's fantastic, I'm amazing. But you get it drummed out of you through the education system, and you learn to judge, they're a good artist, I'm no good at art. So I think drawing is the one that people can struggle with. But if people don't want to do sandboxing now, it's good to have options. So in Kat's study that I was talking about earlier, she had pens, paper, drawing stuff, plasticine, she had sandboxing. So she had this whole bag of tricks and people could choose. But in our other project with sandboxing, with children and young people, some people were like, yeah, I want to do sandboxing. Some people were like, nah, I'll just chat. So it's really going with and I know that can be difficult if you're sort of in a discipline that's saying, you know, everything's got to be the same for every participant, because but it's less about the activity and more about the talk generated. Yeah. So for me, it's just you go with whatever that person wants to do, and then that's the right method for them, and that's the data you generate.
Yeah. Thank you. One more quick question before we close. So somebody's asked, can you say any more about confidentiality and if young people wanted to be involved in dissemination?
Yeah, that's such a tricky one. So the benefit of sandboxing rather than something like photo elicitation or photo voice is that people aren't seen, which is was really important in that research with care experience children and young people. So they couldn't be seen. but there's a tension between concealing and revealing. So if you want it to be co-produced and participatory, and then you tell people they can't be seen, there's a tension in that. So there are lots of projects that focus on the ethics of sort of visibility and being seen, which can be great. So Paul Sweetman did some work in Southampton with a community, and they wanted to be seen, and they had big installations and a big display in the museum, and they had their photographs and their stories. But I think if it's more sensitive data, then that's difficult, because as much as people want to be seen at the time, those pictures, once they're released, are there forever. So there's a lovely research project that Geraldine Brown and Geraldine Brady did with young mothers, and they all wanted to have their stories out there and tell a different discourse, a discourse about young motherhood that wasn't stigmatized, and the project was really successful. But if they then decide in 10 years or 5 years that they don't want those images to be out of them, you can't take them down. So I think you've got to be very, very careful when you're doing collaborative work, that if there's sensitivities around the topic, but also that you might be working with someone who's 17, and when they're 27, they want that to come down. And it can't. And there's some of the research with young offenders, and then they didn't want it there. And how do you get it back once it's been out in photographs?
Thank you. Okay. Unless there's any sort of burning questions anybody wants to raise their hands and ask, I think we're probably best to start sort of wrapping things up. Just want to say all of the sort of links to the things Dawn has mentioned are in the chat. So the ExChange website, the blogs, and also the book codes as well. So just to say thank you so much. It sounds like a really welcoming community, a very interesting book, and I'm really grateful to have had you talk at this ExChange Wales webinar today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.